What's going on, guys? It's Ryan with LEDgardener.com, and I'm super pumped today. I had a box show up on my doorstep from Horticulture Lighting Group, or HLG, and inside that box were 3 quantum board kits, a 90 watt version, a 135 watt version, and a 260 watt version. And in this video, I'm going to show you how I assembled each of these kits. And it may or may not be the exact right way, but this is just a peek at how I built mine. I figured it might be worth something to somebody to record it. So since I think this is going to take some time, I'm going to split this video up, and this will be assembly only. And then in a subsequent video, I'm going to go over exactly how these things work. We'll talk about wiring them in series and parallel, how to dim them, some do's and don'ts, adding additional boards, all that fun stuff. And we'll have a look at some PPFD results as well. But in this video, it'll just be a quick look at how each of these boards go together. Now I'm going to give my standard disclaimer here. If you're not really familiar with electricity and you're not qualified to work on it, maybe skip the driver termination part and get somebody who knows what they're doing to do it for you, just because there's a risk for a lot of bad things to happen, like shock, electrocution, fire, a whole lot of wonderful things like that. So if you don't know what you're doing, just skip that part maybe. And finally, before I get going, I want to send a big shout out to HLG for sending me these boards to play with. Man, these guys are on top of their customer service game. Any questions that I had were answered almost right away, and they definitely know their stuff, so big shout out to HLG. Now, before I get going with the assembly, I just want to review the tools that I needed to do the job. Essentially, all you need is a set of wire strippers and a Phillips screwdriver, but I also used a pair of flush cutters to cut my zip ties and leave a nice clean cut that you're not going to scratch yourself on, and a soldering iron to tin all of my leads. On a Meanwell driver, both on the AC and the DC side, it's stranded wire, and that can be kind of difficult to work with when you're trying to put it into a connector, because you get strands that come loose, they come out, and they're going every which way, and it's kind of a hazard for both shorts and shocks. So I definitely recommend using a soldering iron to tin the leads and keep them nice and solid. Okay, let's get started with the 90 watt kit first. Everything that you see in front of me here is part of the kit, so you shouldn't need any additional pieces except maybe some ratchet straps to hang it. You've got this really nice looking blue anodized heatsink, which is the MaxiPad edition. I must be missing an inside joke there, because that's sort of a funny name for a heatsink. But the sink itself is great. Everything is drilled and tapped and ready to go. You don't have to modify it at all. They include 4 little straps here to hang from the corners, which, as I say, are already drilled and ready to rock. And then you've got the board itself, and I was really blown away by how thin and light this thing is. There's nothing to it, and the back is really smooth too, which is probably why you don't need any thermal compound on it between it and the heatsink. On the front, you'll see the color temperature stamped, and you've got a few connectors for wire, and I'll go into the sort of the in-depth details on how it works in the next video. As part of this kit, you get a Meanwell HLG 80H54A, which is a 54 volt constant voltage driver that's rated for 80 watts, though you can actually get about 90 watts out of it. For connections, on the AC side of the driver, you get this nice IP67 waterproof connector, and I would really recommend using this for your power side. You could also use some of the Wagos, but this is a much more secure way of doing it, and you get that waterproofing, which is nice. These are the Wagos. You might get one of 2 types, the bigger gray ones or the smaller clear ones. Both of them do the exact same thing, and they both work really well. I think these Wago connectors are probably the best things on the market for connecting the DC side of these LED drivers. It's so easy to put cable in and take cable out, and I think I'm going to order a boatload of them for future projects. You also get a little bit of hardware at the top for securing the driver to the heatsink and securing the quantum board to the heatsink, and a chunk of wire here to connect the output of the driver to the board. The first step of assembly is attaching the board to the heatsink. Around the edge of the board, you'll see 6 little slots and 2 holes in the middle, and these are for the short screws that come with the kit. These holes in the board line up with tapped holes on the heatsink, so all you need to do is thread those screws in with nice and even pressure. Again, a really nice feature about these boards is the fact that you don't need any thermal compound between the board and the heatsink, because it would be a nightmare having to apply thermal compound to something this big, but the fact that you don't need any is awesome. Now that the board is secure, it's time to flip it over and put the driver onto the back of the heatsink. These 4 wire connectors in the corners of the board allow you to lay it down on its face because they stick out further than the LEDs do, but I would still definitely recommend putting something soft down just to minimize any risk of damaging those diodes. Now, when you're ready to mount your driver, you'll see that there are 2 holes on either side of the driver, and those are what you're going to put the long bolts that you got in the hardware package through. And once the bolt's through, there are a couple nuts. Those attach on the bottom, and that fastens the driver down onto the heatsink. Okay, now that the driver is fixed to the heatsink, it's time to terminate it. And at this point, if you don't know what you're doing and you're not qualified to work with electricity, definitely get somebody who is to do this for you. There's a lot of potential for bad things to happen. You're working with mains voltage on the AC side and a high voltage on the DC side, so the possibility of shock and electrocution and fire and a ton of other bad things is definitely there. So if you don't know what you're doing, just get somebody else to do it for you. The next thing I tackled was the DC output side of the driver. I decided to use the little clear Wagos just because I like the look of them, and I had found that out of the box, the conductors for the output were not quite stripped enough, so when I would clamp the Wago down, I think it was clamping on the jacket. So I ended up stripping a little bit more of the jacket off just to make sure that the Wagos were making good contact on both of these conductors. I always make sure to give it the old pull test just to make sure that it's seated in there nicely and it's not going anywhere. Next, I unraveled my little bundle of solid core wire and put that into those same Wagos, black to black and red to red, because why would you do it any other way? And then I straightened out my wires and set them aside for now. Once I finished the preparation on the DC side, I moved over to the AC side. On the AC cable, you've got 3 conductors. There's a brown one labeled ACL, a blue one called ACN, and a green one called ground. The L in ACL stands for line or live, that's the hot wire, and the N in ACN stands for neutral. Now, I really like the connector that they give you for the AC side in this kit. It's a waterproof connector here, it splits apart in the middle, and it's got 2 collars on either side that clamp down on the jacket of the cable to make it waterproof, and it makes it a very secure connection as well since there's a lot of strain relief there. So this one side just fits on over, and then you attach each of your 3 conductors onto the screw terminals here. They're slightly different colors. I'm not exactly sure which go to which. I think one of them was black, so that's the one that I put my live on. One of them is like a copper color, which is where I put my ground. And the last is a silver, which is where I put my neutral. You have to be careful because if you don't chop your wires on your meanwhile cable to the right length, then this collar here clamps down on the wires themselves like you see here, not on the jacket. So what you need to do is chop those wires so that they're short enough that that collar is tightening on the black outer jacket and not on the individual conductors. Once I trimmed my wire, I stripped them again and made sure to keep them all the same length and try to keep them about as short as possible while still fitting all the way into the terminals. This is stranded wire too, so it's really important to keep them nice and tight and twisted, and this is where having a soldering iron is a great idea because you can tin these with a little bit of solder, and that keeps everything together and prevents these little stray strands of wire poking through and causing trouble. If you have a strand of wire on 120 volts that's somewhere it shouldn't be, that's a big problem, so use some solder. The amount that I stripped off at the end of these cables after trimming them turned out to be just about perfect. The jacket on each conductor butted right up against the screw terminal, and there was plenty of copper under every one of the screws, so everything fit nicely. There was no stray wires anywhere. Once I tightened up these screws, I was ready to do the other side of the AC connection. So every kit comes with one of these power cables here, and it's got a plug on one side and 3 conductors on the other, a black, a green, and a white, and we have to give it the same treatment as the Meanwell side, where you cut it to length, strip it, solder it, and then plug it into that same waterproof connector. Here you've got the black, green, white, which is different than the brown, blue, green. In this case, typically in North America, the black wire is hot, the white wire is neutral, and the green is ground. So that's how I wired mine. So in that connector, I matched the black side of this one to the brown side, and the white side to the blue side, and the green side to the green side. This is my finished product here. I've double checked all the wire mapping here to make sure hot is to hot, neutral to neutral, ground to ground. And I've also made sure that there are no stray wires and all the screws are nice and tight. Looks good. So now I'm going to seal things up, just screw this together and then clamp down the collars onto the jacket. And as you can see, it is now actually clamping down on the jacket since I shortened those wires, which is much better because it provides a strain relief. So if someone pulls on the cable, it's going to be pulling on the jacket and not trying to pull the conductors out of their terminals. Okay, it's time to revisit the DC output side of this thing. So first thing I did was just to tie wrap the two power cables together to keep them neat and tidy. And then we've got to get the red and the black conductors through the holes in the board onto the other side so we can strip them and plug them into the little beige connectors. On the heatsink, you'll see that on one side you have two sets of holes. There's one right on the edge, that's for the hanger, and then another one about an inch down, and these are for the red and black wires. So just have a look at the board below just to determine which side is positive and negative. In my case, positive is on the far side, negative is on the close side. So that's how I route my wires. The one gripe that I have about this is that I think there's potential for scraping your wires when you're pulling them through here and removing some of that jacket, which would be kind of a bad thing. Like if you were to damage the wire as you pulled it through and expose some bare wire, then you could kind of electrify this heatsink. So I'd like to see like a little grommet on there or something just to make sure that this doesn't happen. But just make sure as you pull your wires through that you're not scraping them along that sharp edge of that hole and they come through nice and free. Once I got the conductors down into the bottom of the board, I lined them up with the connectors and trimmed them to length, and I gave them a bit of a bend on the way in just because I prefer to have a little bit of play rather than going straight into the connector. I think it reduces the chance that it's going to get yanked out and it keeps it a little bit looser. I stripped the cable down to about the same length as the connector itself. I wanted to make sure that there was plenty of bare wire for the connector to pinch down on, but at the same time make sure that there was no bare wire exposed outside of the connector to reduce the chance of a short or a shock. I actually really like the connectors on these boards. They're very strong. Once you push your cable in there, it's really difficult to get it to pull back out unless you use the little tab on top of the connector. And if you use your fingernail or a screwdriver and push down on it, it will release, but if you don't use that tab, you're probably not going to get that cable to budge. It's really well seated. This brings us to the last step before we test this thing, which is attaching the little hanger straps. You get 4 of these straps that all attach to this one carabiner, which is where you would hang your ratchet strap. Everything hangs from this single point, and it's very well balanced actually once it's done. So what I did here is just kind of sorted out each of these straps, split them, 2 to one side, 2 to the other, and then attached each of the clips onto the heatsink. As you can see, it actually hangs very nicely, very well balanced off of just a single point, which surprised me. So just attach a ratchet strap to this one carabiner and you're good to go. Now all I had left to do was to test the thing, so I plugged in the driver and it lit up really nicely and blinded the hell out of me. I definitely recommend using some sort of eye protection for this part. And that's it. That's all there is to it. I'd say one of the easiest assemblies that I've had for a grow light. You get everything that you need in the kit, and you can do the assembly with just a handful of tools. So, very impressed with how easy this was to put together. If you've built one of these things, you've pretty much built them all. The 90 watt and the 135 watt are very similar. The only difference is the fact that the driver mounts on an angle on the heatsink, but I'm going to zip through this super quickly just to show you that it's the same, and then we'll have a look at the 260 watt as well, which has just one main difference, which is the fact that there are 2 boards. So I'll stop and chat about that quickly when we get to that part as well. One other minor difference between the 135, 260, and 90 watt is that the 2 bigger ones come with these little black thumb screws, and there are holes for them to thread into the heatsink, and this is so when you turn the board over, it reduces the chance of any damage happening to those LEDs. Even though the connectors themselves stick out far enough to prevent that, these little black things just add a little extra insurance that it's going to rest on the thumb screw and not anywhere on the board. The driver that's included in this kit is a little bit too long to sit straight across the heatsink, so there are 2 holes that are sort of offset on the board, and that's where you put the screws in on this one. Just like on the 90 watt kit, this is a 54 volt constant voltage driver. This one's a little bit beefier, rated for 120 watts, but capable of doing 135. The power terminations on this driver are the exact same as the other one, so I use the same parts, the waterproof connector on the AC, and then the clear Wagos on the DC output. And there are holes that go through the board just like on the 90 watt to get to the underside, And then again, just strip the cable to the right length, plug it into the connectors and give them a tug, make sure that they're not going anywhere, and that's all there is to it for wiring. Hanging this kit is the exact same as a 90 watt. You get one clip in each corner and then it hangs from a single point. So as you can see, the 90 watt and the 135 watt kits are nearly identical, and this goes for the 260 watt as well, except for the wiring because there's two boards and they go in series. So we'll rip through this build as well and then just kind of slow down for the two board wiring part. The reason that the wiring is a little different on the 260 is that we're using a constant current driver as opposed to the two constant voltage drivers on the other kits. And that's why we need to go series. The model is an HLG 240H C2100, which is able to do 2100 milliamps of current between a voltage of 59 and 119. If you were to series these two boards on one of the other drivers, the constant voltage 54 volt drivers, you'd have a voltage drop of 54 volts plus 54 volts is 108 volts. And obviously they can't provide that because they're 54 volt drivers. Just as a quick refresher, when you wire LEDs in series, the forward voltages add up, but the current through each of them remains the same. So in this case, we have two 54 volt boards for a total of 108 volts, and each of these boards gets the full 2100 milliamps. Now, I'll skip ahead to where I've got the first board mounted. This is sort of an important part here. When you're mounting the second board, you don't want them to look identical. In this case, I've got the logos at the bottom, and the reason being is that the connectors are the same. So there's plus and plus next to each other, minus and minus, and you don't want that because we're going to be wiring in series, and we're going to get to that. But what you want to do is flip the board over so you've got a positive next to a negative on both the top and the bottom, and this is crucial for easy wiring when we get to that. At this point, I've got my two boards screwed down and I've got my 4 black thumb screws on, so I can flip this thing over and start working on the driver. Similar to the 135 watt kit, this driver goes on the 260 heatsink at an angle, but in this case, it doesn't go right over the middle of the light, so you can't hang it from a single point because it's not balanced. So what you need to do is use 2 sets of ratchet straps rather than 1. On this kit, I decided for the hell of it, I would use different connectors than I had on the other 2 kits. So for the DC output side, I used the big gray Wagos, and really they're no different than the clear ones. They're both super easy to use and they both work well. So no difference there. And then on the AC input side, I ended up using the 3 little clear Wagos rather than that big black waterproof connector. And on that one, I think I'm partial to the waterproof connector. Mainly because it's waterproof, but also because of those 2 collars that clamp down on the jacket of the cable. I think that strain relief makes it a lot more robust and a little bit safer, so I like that other connector more than the little Wagos for power. Here's where things are a bit different on this kit compared to the others. There's one hole for you to pull your wires through right in the middle, and that's because both of these boards are right next to one another. In this case, we're going to be wiring the boards in series, so that means the positive from the driver is going to go to the positive of one board, and the negative from the driver is going to go to the negative of the other board. And then what you need to do is join the positive of one board to the negative of the other board, and that's what we're going to do at the bottom. So as you can see, I've got red to the plus on the left, black to the negative on the right, and now I'm going to join the negative and the positive at the bottom, and that's a series connection rather than a parallel. If you were to wire these 2 boards in parallel, so plus to plus, minus to minus, and then back to the driver, then what would happen is you'd end up splitting the current between the 2 boards. So instead of each board getting the full 2100 milliamps, they'd split it and each would get 1050, at least in a perfect world. In practice, they probably wouldn't split it that evenly, which can cause problems. All I've got to do here is put the other half of my power cable on and put the hanger clips on each corner, and we're good to go. The hangers you get in this kit are a little beefier than the other black ones in the 90 and 135 watt kit. And as I mentioned earlier, since the driver is off-center on this light, it doesn't hang from a single point like the 90 watt and the 135 watt do. So in order to hang this kit, you're going to need 2 ratchet straps, and these aren't included with the kit, so you'll need to pick them up yourself. What you do when you've got those straps is take 1/2 of the board, so these 2 clips here, and attach it to one ratchet strap, and then do the same for the other, and you'll have to just hook up your 2 ratchet straps to your tent or whatever it is, and get them both the same length so this thing balances nicely. And there you have it. That's all 3 kits built. And like I said earlier, these things don't come with instructions, so this is just how I built my kits, which may or may not be the ideal way, but there really aren't that many parts, and it's pretty self-explanatory as to how they go together. So all in all, I'd say this is pretty damn easy to do and fast. Man, by the time I was on my third kit, it was only taking me like 10 or 15 minutes to finish this thing, so that's awesome. As for my final thoughts on the QB kits, I would say I'm thoroughly impressed. The parts came really well packaged from HLG, they were easy to put together, quick to put together, and from the preliminary testing that I did, they put out a ton of light. So I can actually quantify that in the next video with some PPFD results, so stay tuned for that as well. I'll also be examining a few other things like how to expand by adding more boards. We'll talk about some limitations on voltage and current on these boards, and I'll go over how to properly dim them. If this video was of any use to you, please like and subscribe, and check out my blog at ledgardener.com. And stay tuned for more content on DIY LED grow lights. See ya!